The Frontier is an independent, not-for-profit organization that undertakes research and education that supports a better public policy of economic growth and better quality of life for our nation. A warm welcome to all of you for this Thinker's Corner, where we're going to discuss and even debate current topics and policy issues that are important for all Canadians. At the Frontier, we sincerely seek to advocate for good public policy that serves all Canadians, regardless of your race or your gender. And we do focus on evidence, science, and of course, rational discussion in a respectful way. Today, we'll be interviewing and having a discussion with Dr. Rod Clifton, historian, researcher, and co-editor of and the authors of Frontier's latest book, From Truth Comes Reconciliation. I wish to turn to a quote from Murray Sinclair, the chair of the commission, who said, "While the TRC, or the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, heard many experiences of unspeakable abuse, we have been heartened by testimonies which affirm the dedication and compassion of committed educators who sought to nurture the children in their care. These experiences must also be heard." Murray Sinclair, chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the Calgary Herald, August 5, 2010. This is both an important topic and one filled understandably with great emotion and concern. And today, in Frontier fashion, we'll be wading into this complex area, and this certainly will not be for the faint of heart who seek black and white answers, but rather evidence based on thoughtful analysis, all in the firm belief that our country needs to get on with reconciliation and certainly a brighter future for all Canadians. Today's webinar will take a little bit of time as we go through the incredible background and complexity of the topic, but I hope you find it interesting and thought-provoking and helpful to you. After my interview with Dr. Clifton, we'll turn to you, the audience, for your written questions. And I know that we will certainly have lots of written questions as we go through. I'd like to introduce Dr. Clifton. Dr. Rodney A. Clifton completed a PhD at the University of Toronto and a Phil doctorate at the University of Stockholm, Sweden. He taught for 6 years at Memorial University and for 32 years at the University of Manitoba. Welcome, Dr. Clifton. Now, I just want to make sure we have your mic on for our audience.
Is the mic on now?
There we go, Dr. Clifton. Welcome.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction.
Dr. Clifton, I had the pleasure of reading this book. It's an extraordinary work, and it's the result of an extraordinary team of interdisciplinary experts who came together. And I certainly encourage all our members to read this book. And you can certainly order it off Frontier's website. But this book, frankly, has so much background and facts that I suspect few Canadians, let alone journalists, are even familiar with. And it even includes some very heart-touching stories about everyone involved. And that includes stories of yourself and your involvement with this whole complex story of Indian residential schools. And one of the things I noted in this book was a dedication, and I want to read it to our audience. It said, "This book is dedicated to the thousands of people, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, who were good and honorable servants to the children in Canada's Indian residential school system. The book is also dedicated to all former IRS students, not only for those for whom the residential school experience was demonstratively a positive enriching of their lives and the lives of their descendants, but also those who greatly suffered as a result of their experiences." Dr. Clifton, why did you and the team choose to dedicate the book in that fashion?
We are attempting to provide some clarity and on an issue that is very complex and has been polarized in Canadian society. And we truly think that everyone that was involved should be heard. So before going on, I would just like to mention my co-authors and collaborators. Mark DeWolf was the second editor along with me for the book. Joseph Quiznow and Francis Widdowson, Jerry Bowler, Jaime Rubenstein, Brian Giesbrecht, Masha Krylova, Lee Meadows, and Marshall Draper were also authors. And all of us have had experiences in various ways with people that have been dispossessed, or Aboriginal people in Mark and my situation. And we truly think that we are going somewhat down the wrong track at the present time. And we would like to have clarity about exactly what we're doing and what we're going to achieve.
So you dedicated this book really out of a care for both sides of that story, if you will.
Absolutely.
In an effort to understand the truth as best
And
you're able to, so that we can really pursue this great project referred to commonly as reconciliation with Aboriginal persons.
absolutely. The subtitle of our book is Truth Comes Before Reconciliation. And Murray Sinclair and the other members of his team believe in that. And we have some questions about, the truthfulness of some of the things that were said and reported in the report, and should be adjudicated in a more carefully.
Well, Dr. Clifton, we're so grateful to have you on the program today. And we've got a pretty ambitious agenda. So what I'd like to propose to do is we'll go through a number of brief questions to kind of set the stage, the facts, if you will, about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Sure.
We've heard an awful lot about it. It's a massive document. And one of the things, I have a confession to make, is that initially I didn't realize this is a monster document. It's almost 4,000 pages. Is that correct?
That's true. 1.5 million words.
I stand corrected. So it's a large.
No, that's just elaborating upon 3,700 pages, something like that. So you can round it off as 4,000 pages or 3,500 pages, but 1.5 million words, which is a lot of words.
So it's remarkable. So I think that's a key point here, isn't it, to understand it, is that not many people are reading this original document, and yet your team is. Because in my own reading, I read the summary, which is a mere 350 pages long.
Yeah.
And I was kind of surprised that it had, well, how should we say, kind of a summary of content. It didn't have a lot of depth to each issue, but it had a lot of actions and recommendations. But we're talking, when we say the report, we mean the larger document,
yeah.
The almost 4,000 pages, correct?
Yeah, 6 volumes, 4,000 pages long, just about.
So have many people read that document, do you think, in your experience? Are you sensing?
It's hard to know.
Yeah.
But from what I read in the newspaper reports and here on radio and TV, it's quite obvious that many of the reporters haven't got a clue about what is actually said in the report, because they're making statements that are completely contrary to what the report itself says.
Okay, so that in itself is an important point, is that often we refer to the report. It's really not the reports that's being referred to. It's often the summary. So just to back up for a sec, I think you've got a fascinating story, Dr. Clifton, not the least of which is, how did you get interested in Indigenous issues? How did you get involved in this as a young man?
I got old quick, still young. When I was in first year university in 1964 at the University of Alberta, there was a program called cross-cultural education, in which they were educating people in faculty of education, which I was in, to teach on Indian reserves or Métis colonies, which there's a number of Métis colonies in Alberta. And I enrolled in that program. And one of the expectations was that you did an internship, and I was assigned to the Blackfoot Reserve in southern Alberta, Siksika First Nation, which is 100 kilometers east of Calgary on the Trans-Canada Highway and south of there. So that was my first, the first experience that I've had on a reserve, though in the small town that I grew up in, there were Indian children that were going to school with me and in the school that I went to. So I wasn't unfamiliar with these children. At the end, I resided in Old Sun Residential School, which was still in operation at the time, though all of the kids were being sent out. Most of the kids, not all of them, were being sent out to schools in the surrounding school divisions to be educated, so they're bussed out. But there were kids still residing in the school, and there were 3 orphan girls from Hobima who didn't even speak the same language. They spoke Cree in the school, and they stayed in the school all summer. These children were the Roasting sisters, and the kids and myself and Father Brown, who was the Anglican priest, all had ate together and did things together at that time. Towards the end of the year, the Indian Affairs, which was supposed to pay me a small stipend, didn't pay me, or they paid me later in November, but I didn't have any money at the end of the year. I had a bill for room and board at Old Sun, and I was going to go back to university, so I needed money for tuition fees and room and board in Edmonton to go back to university. I saw an ad in the Anglican Journal for a residential supervisor in Stringer Hall in Inuvik, and I applied for that position and got it. Over the phone, I talked to Reverend Holman, and he hired me, and I went home to see my parents for a few days, went to Edmonton, got on to a Pacific Western DC-4, and flew for 12 hours to get to Inuvik because it stopped at all the communities along the way up the Mackenzie River. And in Inuvik, I was responsible for supervising the senior boys in this hostel. The school was next door, so the kids stayed in the hostel and went to school. And I was responsible for 85 kids, 22 hours a day, 6 days a week, with Sunday off. And I spent a year doing that. Now, obviously, the kids weren't in the residence if they were in school, but if a child was sick, then they would be either in the residence or in the infirmary. So if they were in the residence, then I was responsible for them.
So this is a remarkable story, which is part of your own story.
Part of my story, yeah.
And you're also, your family's also of Aboriginal background.
Yes, my wife is Blackfoot. I met her when I went to work for my internship on the Blackfoot Reserve, and I met her, she was typing for Father Brown, typing sermons and letters for him and other things, and so we met in the residential school and started going out and eventually got married 53 years ago.
Wow, congratulations.
Thank you.
So in this context, how did you end up having an interest in doing such an audacious project on such a hot topic, like doing an assessment on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission? Are you crazy? What happened to you?
Crazy is a good term to use. When the report first came out in 2015, I wrote an article about how the definition of genocide was a very liberal definition, and that it didn't it wasn't true to the more strict definition of genocide, which means the murder of people from a certain ethnic group or a certain religious group, and wrote something about that, and then it started from there, in which I was quite a bit of a skeptic of some of the things that were being claimed in the report.
Okay, so that kind of perked your interest in saying, wow, these are significant claims to make, and there's a debate around these types of claims, and so you decided that as a good academic and researcher and historian, no less, this would be an important project to undertake, bringing together really an extraordinary team of interdisciplinary experts, and this is what you've come up with the last
Yes.
5 years.
5 years.
Is That's a long time. So in this case, is this, to the best of your knowledge, the only kind of critical assessment undertaken in our country named Canada?
There are some very good short papers written in C2C. Paul Bruner has got one, and there's a few. There were some things in Alberta Report. There were some things in some religious journals that were skeptical, but nothing as systematic and nothing as analytical as our piece is.
Okay, so
So
this is
we've gone
really
for
a
anybody.
landmark type of undertaking.
Yeah, it
So
is.
if we could rapid fire go through some of these basic facts, I think that would help set the stage, because this is quite a far-reaching discussion. But what was the budget for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission?
The budget just to run the commission was $60 million in 5 years, but they extended it by a year. And the cost didn't include the compensation that was going to go to people as a result of the claims that they made. So there were some millions, close to billion dollars
Okay.
that were actually expended as a result so
All right.
far on this issue.
Okay, so as in keeping with the tradition of being a royal commission, significant monies were devoted to the project, and then out came the report. In
Yeah.
this case, again, the report is how long?
6 volumes, 3,500, more than 3,500 pages.
And you've carefully examined with your team every page.
Every page.
Wow.
There is not a comprehensive index. And so in order to find all the material that we wanted to summarize, we had to read everything and classify things and then put them into groups that we could actually summarize.
Okay. So
we
in a quick nutshell, Dr. Clifton, what was the purpose of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission?
It come out of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People, which published its report in 1996. And in that report, there were some claims about children being abused in schools and mistreated in schools, which we frankly think is true, that some children were abused and badly treated in the schools. But we don't think that every child was abused and every child was badly treated. Most of the children were separated from their families for extended periods of time. Some children in the southern part of Canada went home on Friday afternoon and then come back Sunday morning so that their parents could go to the church. That was the chapel in the school, and that was the local parish church. So some children were in schools for a short period of time. Other children were in school for a longer periods of time.
So this is a very complex story.
Yes.
Because the residential schools, over what period of time did they run?
The oldest one that's included in the group of residential schools that were included in this report was the Mohawk Institute, which was an Anglican school that began in 1833 and was running as a residential school up until this past century.
So it goes back a long time.
Yes.
Doing my math, some 100 and how many years? 130 years. It's a long time, well over a century.
Yeah.
And how many schools were there, Dr. Clifton?
In total, there were 143 schools included in the report. The report itself says there's 139, but if you actually count the schools that they have listed, there's 143 of them.
So the commission itself ironically got the number wrong. It's actually a little bit higher.
Yeah.
And this is over a long period of time, many schools involved. So logically, one cannot generalize too much because of that long story. It's a complex story, is it not?
Yeah. Not only is it long, it's convoluted as well, because some schools were managed by religious denominations, and then they changed religious dominations, and the federal government sometimes come in and ran schools. So about 20% of the schools were actually run by the federal government. Not quite 20%, 16% of the schools.
Okay, so the federal government itself ran them. There were other denominations that they reached out to. Why did they reach out to different denominations, Dr. Clemson?
Since the very beginning of Canada, many Christian groups had schools for either employees of the Hudson Bay, for other people, for clergy, for other people that were involved in creating communities in Canada. And often they would bring Aboriginal kids into their schools that were for the Anglicans and Methodists. The school might be in their home and they're educating their own children. So they would bring some of the Indigenous children in and educate them as well.
Okay.
And there's a list in the document about people that were educated in this sort of historically.
Now, forgive me, I'm a layperson, so I'm trying to understand this story. So why were residential schools even established? Why did we just leave it be? What was the strategic issue or goal that we're trying to pull off as a nation here? What's the context here?
There were two types of schools created for Indigenous people. And the argument was that as the society was changing, the buffalo were being eliminated in the West. And so the prairie Indians had a hard time maintaining themselves because it was more and more difficult to kill buffalo and to provide food for themselves. And in the northern parts, the fur trade was decreasing as the French and other people stopped using beaver pelts for hats, for the creation of men's hats. So that market then started to dry up. And then people thought, well, how are these people going to maintain themselves in this new society if they're not educated? So they said, well, they should be educated as well as non-Indigenous children are educated.
The context here is really the story of a nation trying to come to grips with a people that in order to fully participate in society, education was important. Education was the answer, combined with faith at the time, Christian faith, as people needed the skills to be able to thrive and engage in the new Canada that was emerging with industrialization. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so when we look at the residential schools, who ran them? Like who were really running the day-to-day operations of the school?
There's a variety. I could talk about the denominations first. So the greatest number of schools were run by the Roman Catholic churches, various agencies of the Roman Catholic churches. So it could be a group of nuns, it could be a group of priests that are running them. And they ran 62 schools, 43% of them. Church of England, at the very beginning, before they were called the Anglican Church, ran 35 schools. Federal government ran 23 schools. United Church and the Methodists and the other ones that come together to form the United Church ran 19 schools. And here's something that probably very few people that are listening realize is that the Mennonite Church ran 3 schools in the 1990s. And the Baptist Church managed one school in the Yukon.
Okay. So when we look at the overall goal to run these residential schools, and I know this is a vigorous debate, there were arguably good intentions, or was it all evil? To quote, get rid of the native culture, the entire belief system. Is it that black and white? What really
I don't,
happened?
I don't think it's that black and white. In the school that I worked in Nunavik, which was an Anglican school, um, and this was in the mid 1960s, 66, 67. Uh, there were two young Inuk women that were worked with the junior boys and the junior girls, and they spoke Inuktitut to these kids all the time.
So it was common then in residential schools that children would speak their language, or were also English?
It was common that kids would speak their native language in the schools, and if you think about uh, the difficulty that it would be, in my case, being responsible for 85 kids in 3 dorms, to actually stop them from speaking their native language if they chose to do it, and it was the kids were encouraged to speak English, but it was a game to try. They would speak
Okay,
Inuktitut.
so just a quick pause here. When you talk about life in residential schools, how is your information accurate? Are you just, like as in statistics, cherry picking data, or did you look at detailed reports around the operation of these schools? Like some of this goes back 100 years. How do we know what really happened? I know that
Yeah,
were there anthropological case studies or
yeah,
analysis you could draw from?
yeah. Yeah, there are, and there's quite a few documents that are available. The TRC Commission report itself has got 2 big volumes on the history that isn't reflected fairly, in my mind, in the summary volume. That has got much more of the nuances in those documents than
Okay.
is in the summary
Okay, I just
document.
want to stop you there for a sec, Dr. Clifton.
No problem.
You're saying there's the original report, almost 4,000 pages long, and then there's the summary, which a lot of people in public confuse that with being the actual report. But in fact, that's a summary.
Yeah.
And you're saying that the summary doesn't really reflect the original report. What do you mean by that?
It doesn't reflect much of the positive things that are said in the original report. And there is a mixture of both positive and negative in the total report that is not reflected adequately in the summary document.
Wow. So
So
that
people
would
be getting
be
a
a
biased
surprise for
person.
most people. Would you agree with that? Like, would that would that fact that the report isn't reflected so much in the summary, would that surprise a lot of people?
I'm absolutely convinced that it would be. And one of the reasons that we wrote ours is to provide clarity on exactly that. All the references and all the evidence that we provide in our book come from the report itself, was supplemented by other studies that were done that we knew about.
Okay.
For example, in the early 1960s, uh, there was a very famous social anthropologist at um, the University of Washington, George Spengler, and he had a number of his PhD students do case studies of Aboriginal communities and schools in Canada. None of these case studies are referenced in the TRC Commission report, which we found to be quite exceptional. So one of the studies is called the school at Mopass, which is the school in Carcross in the Yukon. Another one is called the Kuatl Village and School. And there's a series of these in which PhD students actually went out and did case studies of Aboriginal communities in British Columbia, the Yukon, um, and these published these as monographs.
Okay. So your team actually looked at these case studies. Are they, um, what would you say about the quality or the standard of that type of research? Are they credible standards? Are they
Yeah, they're
ones that
credible.
were in depth?
Yeah, they're credible standards. And when I was working in Nunavik, when I was in the residential school there, John Honigman wrote this book. Him and his wife Irma were in Nunavik doing a study of the integration of Inuit people into urban society. John Honigman and Irma Honigman were very famous socioanthropologists from University of North Carolina, and they'd come up to Nunavik to spend the year studying the community and how people were integrated from the fishing camps and hunting camps into an urban environment. And part of their study includes the residential schools as well, which I helped with. And there's pictures of kids getting inoculations, which kids are still getting today. And here's a picture of the school.
Wow. So Dr. Clifton, there's actually quite a bit of data and careful research that's been done both historically from a sociological perspective, anthropologist, to name a few. Was that information incorporated into the Truth and Reconciliation Commission? Was that part of their mandate? I guess what I'm trying to understand is that was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission doing a kind of a best practices academic research, or what was really the end product they ended up with?
I don't think it's credible academic product because they began with their conclusion that there was genocide and then sorted and sifted the information to actually put the information in such a way that it actually supported that. So the beginning of the summary volume and the volumes of the report itself begin with the conclusion.
Okay,
That's
so
not the way you do academic work. You actually set up some hypotheses and you try to balance the evidence on one side, on the other side to see, whether there's enough evidence to support a particular perspective. So there was a lot of
why is that important to you to actually sift through that evidence and information? Why should Canadians really care about that?
They should care about that because the report itself says that truth is a precondition for reconciliation. And if we don't have what the truth is, then how can we reconcile on the basis of false or lies?
Okay.
So
Wow.
it's either self-interest or some other interest that would be driving.
So your basic premise is in order to have reconciliation, and we're not entirely necessarily clear what that means,
No.
but we need truth. We need evidence and facts and rational discourse to be able to undertake that kind of project.
Yep.
So speaking of projects, this was a massive one, the book that you undertook. How was it organized in a nutshell? Can you just break it down into how that book came together and the kind of themes?
We begin with an introduction, as all books do, and then we have 3 parts. The first part is understanding the TRC report, and the first chapter in that part, there's 2 chapters, Antecedents to the TRC report by Joseph Quisnell, and then putting the TRC report into context, which is done by myself and Mark DeWolf, which is actually a summary, 29 issues that should be addressed, should be understood by Canadians. And we sorted and sifted through the whole report and found the answers to these 29 questions. Then after that, we have a section apart on a critical analysis of the report. So Francis Widdowson has got 2 chapters. Jerry Bowler, historian, has got a chapter, Is the Final Report of the TRC Good History? Jaime Rubenstein's got a chapter. Brian Giesbrecht, a lawyer and judge, has got a chapter, Legal Perspective on the TRC. Masha Krylova has got one, Negative Attributions in the TRC report, in which he argues that the TRC report makes the explanation that all of the bad things that have happened to Aboriginals can be attributed to either residential school or to colonialism, and that kind of attribution is not a very good way of making your way in the modern world. If you continually see yourself as a victim of past circumstances. And there's a lot of psychological research on that. Then we have a section on personal reflections, in which those of us that were in residential schools and worked in them, Lee Meadows, Abandoning Binary Thinking, Mark the Wolf, who spent 6 years on the Blood Reserve, going to school at St. Paul's, the Anglican residential school there, and sitting in a classroom with the kids there. And my experience at Indian residential school, in both the experience that I've had at Old Sun and then at Stringer Hall, and then Marshall Draper talking about his experience as a Hudson Bay manager in northern Manitoba and northwestern Ontario, and seeing kids go to residential school and kids going to school in those small rural communities.
Well, so this is a very far-reaching project. You not only looked at the data, the type of past research and information, but the TRC report in itself, all close to 4,000 pages, as well as these kinds of critical analyses. This is really quite extraordinary. So when, for fear of asking too big a question, what was the point? What do you end up with in terms of your key lessons learned coming out of this assessment?
Well, there's a number of lessons that we learned that we talk about in our book, but let me mention three that stand out. The first one is that over the last 6 years, we've heard innumerable stories about people that have been abused and sexually and physically abused in residential schools. However, if you go through their whole report, you will find about a dozen names of people who have been charged and convicted, scattered through the report. So people in their testimony sometimes said that they were abused, but they didn't mention the person's name. And in some cases, they would mention the person's name. They've been dead, or it's difficult to determine whether, the truth of that statement. It's important to realize that some people were abused, and we should also be sympathetic to those claims when it's true. But it's very surprising that all we've heard about is the abuse of children, and yet when you go through the report, of the thousands of people who worked in these schools, of which there were both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal, all you find is the names of about a dozen people. None of them Aboriginal. Now, it seems quite strange that if Aboriginal people worked in the schools, that if most of these people abused children, that some children would have been abused by the Aboriginal people as well.
So let's just back up for a sec. So you're saying that we know for a fact that within residential schools, there was a mixture of people working with children, both the teachers, principals, that were both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal.
Yeah, most people don't know that, but this happens to be the truth from the very beginning of the schools, that there were Aboriginal people working in the schools.
And just to clarify, so out of this sad story of abuse, are you saying there's only been 12 people charged?
12 people that have been charged and convicted, yes, about that.
So did the Truth and Reconciliation Commission make any criminal referrals? They received a lot of evidence of abuse, which is tragic. Did the commission make any criminal referrals?
That was the second point that we were going to make, and that is that there's some claims in the report that were not treated as seriously as we thought they should have been, and it should have been really clarified whether it was true or not.
So in this case, though, to be very clear, Dr. Clifton, if there was abuse, it's vital, in your opinion, that what action should have been taken?
Yes, very clear.
There should have been criminal referrals and
absolutely. With some of the claims that were made, there two of the people, Murray Sinclair and Wilton Littlechild, were lawyers, and the claims were made that there was a murder, for example, at Elkhorn, in which one person reported in the report that she observed blood all over the wall and blood being spattered and a
Mm.
child being killed. And they never questioned that person about the veracity of what she said. They
Mm.
never questioned any other student about that, and they never uh, questioned any of the people that worked in that Anglican residential school about that, and they never referred it to the RCMP to be adjudicated in a fair
Oh,
and judicious legal way. So it's left standing in the report as if Anglicans actually killed a kid in the residential school.
wow. So
Now,
this is a somewhat of a surprise to me. So you're saying that people came forward and gave their testimony out of their courage, or they were sharing this tragedy,
yeah,
and yet there was no kind of due diligence. Is that right? Is that the word, due diligence, in terms of those kind
uh,
of things?
we think it is the correct word. We think that this should have been referred to the police to be examined more carefully, because we think if a child had been murdered, that those people who actually did that should be charged and convicted and punished for doing this kind of behavior.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
it was reported in the report, and there was no indication that anybody else was asked about this. None of the employees of the school, none of the other children were asked about this. No letters were submitted to the Anglican Church asking for about the records on this incident, and nothing referred to the RCMP. I can't imagine two lawyers listening to that sort of thing and thinking, oh my gosh, I'm
Mhm.
going to report this as being
Yeah,
true, without making sure that every single I is dotted and every single T is crossed before I make such
yeah.
an outrageous claim.
Well, no, thank you for that point. Justice is justice for
Right,
all, just
right.
simply who.
Yes,
So just
exactly.
to clarify then, when we get back to the report, Dr. Clifton, um, when we had the involvement of churches, denominations, did any of these denominations apologize? What I've heard now in the media the last while is that um, those apologies didn't really happen. Is that right? Like our prime
No,
minister,
they happened.
Catholic
They
Church,
happened.
never apologized.
Yeah, every single church has apologized at least once, and the Roman Catholic churches, the various dioceses, and the various parishes, and the various orders have all apologized. So I think if you added them up, the Roman Catholic Church has apologized 50 times, but
50
still
pounds.
in somewhere around close to that. It's a huge pile of apologies that they've made, many apologies that they've made. The Anglican Church has apologized at least twice. The United Church has apologized 2 or 3 times. Every other church has apologized for the treatment of
Oh, wow.
children in these schools. Yeah.
Okay. So when we look at a number of questions, I do have a couple. One of which is, if you are listeners are interested in hearing more or looking more at the original documents of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission beyond the reading the book, where can they find those?
They're on the web, so you can actually find them by looking at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and you should be able to download them freely and read them. They're very complicated, and there's a lot of things to go through in them, and there's some heart-rendering statements in there, but they're available and can be read.
But it's
Uh,
worthwhile looking at them. Now, is there an easy index to follow and be able to
No, there
accept?
isn't. No, there isn't an
Pardon
index.
me?
Some of the volumes have indexes, and some volumes don't have indexes, which is very strange. And there is no overall index for the total report. So if you're looking for, let's say, the school that I lived in, Old Sun, you would have to actually go through the indexes that are in the 3 or 4 volumes that have indexes, and then you'd have to go through all the rest of them to find the references. You couldn't find it by going to an index and and finding all the references to
Okay.
either people or schools or
All right.
whatever.
So I have another question. This has to do with payouts. We know that out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, there were many calls to action. We want to come back to that in a moment. But the
Okay.
question really is, what in summary were the payouts? And obviously, there were a lot of people who got received money from this as compensation, which is very important and fair.
Yeah.
The question is, how many dollars are we talking about, and what was the process in essence for those
Okay.
payouts?
There were two uh, payout programs. One was called uh, was the general treatment payout. So people would get $10,000 for the first year that they were in residential school, or part of the year, and then $3,000 for each year after that. The average person in the last, from the 1970s to the 1990s, or maybe the 1960s to the 1990s, the average person in that payout had been in the school for 4.5 years. So they got a payout of about $20,000 as a
Sorry,
result of their experience.
$12,000. Okay.
Yeah. The range was from 1 year to 12 years. Very few people with 12 years. My wife was in school for 10 years. So she got $37,000 as a payout for. The other payout was uh, claims of abuse. If people claimed that they had been abused, then the payouts went from very low. They grouped it. The bottom group was up to $49,000, and the top group was about $450,000,
Okay.
depending upon the kind of uh, abuse that they reported that they received.
Okay. So then was there a legal process by which people had to assert their claim um, for that kind of compensation?
There was a semi-legal process for each of these claims. So people who just claimed that they had common experience would then send. Indian Affairs were sending out documents, and people would fill in forms, and they would send it to Indian Affairs or to whatever it was called at the time, that Department of the federal government, and then they would look at it to see if there was evidence from the schools or from Indian Affairs documents that would support it, and if there were evidence, then they would make the payout to the people. If
All right.
there was no evidence, then it would go through an adjudication procedure where they would actually look for evidence and see, if there was if they'd made a mistake, or
Okay.
if
So just to
one of
clarify,
their.
in your wife's case, did she, what was her experience like within the residential school setting? I know this is anecdotal, but this is,
Yeah.
I mean, you've obviously had conversations with many, many people um, about their residential school experience.
Yeah. It was mixed. When at the very beginning, when she was very young, she didn't like being away from her parents. Um, but eventually, in her family, there were 10 children, and their house wasn't that large. So it was easier on her parents if some of the children were away at residential school, because then they had more space and more food and more things for the other children, the younger children that were there. Um, in her school, which is quite common for southern schools, she went home on the weekends. So her parents would come and get her and the other kids in the school on Friday afternoon, take them to their farm, and then bring them back on Sunday morning, so that the parents and the children would go to church, which was in the chapel in the school, and then they would go down to her grandmother's place, which was a couple of miles away, and stay there for a couple of hours, and then their parents would bring them back to the school
Hmm.
and drop them off, and then go home.
Now, there's been a lot of understandable concern, if not outrage, around the assertion that children were taken away from their parents forcibly. Um, what happened if we look at the big picture and history of residential schools? Was that common? What happened?
It's hard to know. I don't think it was completely universal, that's for sure. And I think in many places, if parents didn't want their children to go to school, they could simply disappear into the bush, or in the north where I worked, they could go out on the barrens and nobody would be able to find them.
Mhm.
And when I was working in Inuvik, I had a list of kids that were supposed to be in my dorm, and there were some kids not on that list. And so I asked Reverend Holman, and he said, well, the parents had decided to keep these children at home because they needed them on the trap lines and in the hunting camps to help with the work that had to be done there.
Okay.
So there were both girls and boys that weren't in residential school because the parents had decided that they would stay at home.
So in all fairness, we're not totally sure on that one. It's hard to generalize, but generally as a rule, we do know that parents were quite involved in the decision for their children to go to
Uh,
school. And
uh,
how were
parents,
schools even set up, Dr. Clifton? Like, how did the federal government just simply establish a school? How did they relate to the nearby First Nation communities?
well, I brought Treaty 6 with me and a few other treaties. And the numbered treaties, which are in the Canadian West, from uh, Western Ontario to British Columbia, are very similar in terms of the way that they're written. And in Treaty 6, this is what it says. And further, Her Majesty, Queen Victoria, agrees to maintain schools for instruction in such reserves hereby made to her as to her government of the Dominion of Canada may seem advisable whenever the Indians of the reserve shall desire it. So they didn't build schools until the chief and band council and the parents said that they wanted schools built.
Okay. So there was you're saying there was a protocol, a step-by-step
Yep.
process where they would want to work with the band council to
Yep.
establish a residential school.
Yep.
Okay.
Both either day schools or residential schools. And I think the debate that's going on is generally missing this crucial point, is that in many places, including the Blackfoot Reserve and including Treaty 6, which is around this area here for the Plains and Wood Cree Indians, they had to actually petition to get a school built when they wanted it.
Okay. I want to bring up a difficult question. Were you surprised by the quote find of unmarked graves in Canada now today in Saskatchewan?
Yeah, absolutely not, because
Absolutely not.
absolutely not, absolutely not.
And why do you say that?
Um, for two reasons, basically. First of all, if any of the reporters had read the TRC Commission report,
That's the
particularly
original one, the big one.
the big one, yeah, specifically Volume 4. If you turn Volume 4 to Chapter 3, the title on Chapter 3 is "Where Are the Children Buried? Cemeteries and Unmarked Burials." So they actually wrote a 15, 16-page chapter on unmarked graves and burial sites. Now, let me explain a little bit about this, is that in many of the residential schools that were run by the churches, there was a chapel. And the chapel, in many cases, was also the parish church for the local community. So on the Blackfoot Reserve, Old Sun was the parish church. The chapel in Old Sun was the parish church for the Anglicans on the west end of the reserve. And the chapel in Crowfoot, which was at Cluny, was the Roman Catholic Church for the parishioners that were Roman Catholic on that side of the reserve. Along with those chapels and churches, chapel/churches, there were cemeteries. In many of the cemeteries, and I've been to quite a few cemeteries on reserves, there are numerous unmarked graves. Unmarked graves. In fact, my wife's brother, Arthur, died about 10 years ago. And a few years ago, we went to the cemetery, which is called um, Archdeacon Strachan's cemetery, and looked for his grave, and we couldn't find it. We didn't remember where it was. Many of the graves would have a wooden cross, perhaps, and some flowers there, but over time, they would deteriorate and get blown away with the wind or whatever. It moves. So there's lots of graves that are unmarked in that particular graveyard and many other graveyards that I've been to. And I went to the graveyard in the cemetery in Tuktoyaktuk, and there were many unmarked graves there. Many, yeah. So I wasn't surprised at all about this.
So
I was surprised that people were
there was
surprised.
a lot of research and consideration then, interesting enough, in the Truth and Reconciliation report about the whole issue, the dynamic around unmarked graves, and
There is a chapter about that, yeah.
there's a whole
And there's a report that they commissioned by a fellow by the name of Hamilton from the Lakehead University that wrote a report for the TRC Commission on unmarked graves, and he was looking at satellite images and trying to determine where these graves were. So there's been quite a bit of work done on this, and yet when the news broke, it sounded as if people were amazed that there were cemeteries associated with residential schools or close to residential schools, and that some of them had actually started to return back to nature. But
okay, so based on your knowledge and expertise, Dr. Clifton, what should really happen in the case of unmarked graves? What should we be doing as a nation when it comes to these sites?
The Aboriginal people have lived in North America for 18,000 years. So there are thousands, if not millions, of burial sites around our country. And as we've urbanized from small communities and from small fishing and hunting camps ourselves into urban areas, many cemeteries have become unused and have been abandoned, and I don't know what should be done about this, but we're making a big issue over something that newspaper reporters, government officials, Aboriginal leaders should have certainly known about. When I was on the Blackfoot Reserve, one of the fellows took me to show me a burial ground where Blackfoot were buried on scaffolds. They would build scaffolds and put people on the scaffolds. I bet you could go to the reserve and ask anybody where that is, and nobody would actually know where it is. It's just returned back to nature.
But to be practical, in the case of the Kamloops grave or the one in Saskatchewan,
Cemetery.
there would be records, and one
There
could.
were now, as with depending upon when when the graves were actually dug, there would be a map of who was where buried, and there would be records. But sometimes in the residential schools, and this happened in Kamloops, they had a wooden school before the one that's there now, and it burnt down. So sometimes those records would be missing because of them burning down.
But the point is, there's a long history here, and we don't necessarily know. And in order to do any type of confirmation, you'd have to do ultimately a forensic investigation.
Yeah.
Because ground radar is more like a sonar. Is that correct in terms of being able to identify what this is about?
Yeah, in terms of the reliability and validity of this instrument, if you look at the reliability and validity of a number of instruments, it's very low. So it shows very shadows that can be detected in the ground, and you could detect the general shape of it, but you could never determine the age or whether it was a child or an adult, or whether it was
Yeah.
a child of 3, which was one of the first reports to come out,
Right.
that a child of 3 was, they detected that with sonar.
Okay, so it would be important to verify records both in archive, but also using modern scientific method to be able to
Yep,
determine what really are the facts here.
yep.
I guess my question would be, Dr. Clifton, you've been around this issue and this research for some time. Why is it suddenly coming out as a surprise that somehow these unmarked graves are a surprise? What's going
Either people are intentionally trying to make an issue out of this, or they haven't read the TRC Commission report, and they haven't gone to the National Center and the archives for the National Center, which is here in Winnipeg, to actually look at what has been collected on these unmarked graves. Uh, Everybody that I know is not surprised at this. Anybody that's been to a cemetery on Aboriginal Reserve, or anybody that's been to an old cemetery, even close to a cathedral or something like that in Western Canada, let's say it's 100 years old, you walk around there and you will see unmarked graves, or you will see, graves with no stone markers on them, or the stone markers deteriorated to such a degree that you can't tell who
okay?
who is there.
We we're coming to the end of our webinar shortly, but I did want to turn to action.
Yes.
There's a lot of, I think Canadians are rightly concerned about this issue and wondering, how do we come together to be able to deal with both the tragedy of residential schools, but also the truth of it in a way that helps move reconciliation forward in a way that is actually constructive. So, what's your comment on that? What is reconciliation? What is your vision for the future when we look at these difficult issues?
Uh, I think the way it's set up, it's impossible if we keep going at it the way we're going now to get to reconciliation. And the reason is fundamentally is because the calls to action are all made as demands from one group of people, Indigenous people, to other people. So if we take a look at call to action number 11, just as an example, we call upon the federal government to provide adequate funding to end the backlog of First Nations students seeking a post-secondary education. Adequate funding to stop the backlog. Does that mean that every person in the age cohort should go? Should they all be able to go to college, or should they be able to go to university? Should they be able to do all the way up to a PhD or postdocs on the basis of this funding? There's no limit to what they're asking for. It's extreme. It's per, open-ended right from the very beginning. And
Mhm.
that's not the only one. All of them are written in this sort of way. So can you imagine a chief saying that I've got adequate funding? If the funding went up from 100% from last year to this year, would any chief stand up and say, I've got adequate funding? Absolutely not.
Okay.
They would reach for more.
So there's a lot
So
more to learn here, and you're concerned about the call to action being very open-ended in terms of funding. And the question is, will that really help our country and Indigenous people move forward?
I think we're polarized, and if we keep polarization, if we don't back down from where we are, the federal government saying that they're going to abide by every call to action, and Aboriginal people saying that unless every call to action is fulfilled in full, we haven't reached a reconciliation. I think that's an absolutely impossible task to get to that kind of resolution. I think we've got to have much more tolerance and much more sympathy for each other, and much more cooperation going on than this kind of process.
Okay. I'd like to ask For further questions that are coming in, I'm taking a number of them. Please raise your question, please, through the chat. You're welcome to do that in terms of our discussion. There's been a number of them, but this has been an extraordinary project with your team, Dr. Clifton. And I certainly encourage all our audience members to be able to read the book, to be able to look at the analysis. It's a profound analysis. One question we have here is, does the demand for compensation enhance reconciliation, Dr. Clifton?
Wow, that's a loaded question. It's hard to say. If it is based upon true abuse and difficulties that people have had that are unknown to other people, then perhaps it is. But if it's not perfectly verified, then I think that it may in fact be sowing the seeds of dissent in the general population who are going to pay this money. I myself was in a sanatorium for a year and a half when I was between 2 and 5, and it wasn't a very good experience, but that was the way things were done at that period of time. Okay. So anybody that's been treated badly, should they be able to get compensation from other people?
So another large question would be the word genocide. This is a big word that we discussed a little bit earlier. Where did the charge of genocide really come from?
I come from a United Nations document that was published in the 1940s that has a very broad and expansive definition of genocide, in which it says in there that there are various levels of process that result in the combination of genocide. One is taking children away from their parents and doing things with them. So at that time, people were thinking about the Aryan children that were taken away from Slavic people, the Aryan-looking children that were taken away from Slavic people, then sent to Germany to be raised as Germans. But if you read the dictionary definition, the common sense definition of genocide, it says it's a mass extermination of human beings, especially a particular race or nation. So we think of the Holocaust, the extermination of the Jews in Europe during the 1930s and the 40s. We think of the Holodomor, the killing of, starving to death of Ukrainian people by the Soviet Union. We think of Rwanda. We think about those kinds of things as being true genocides. We don't really think about forcing people to go to school, if that happened, as being genocide.
All right. So the debate continues. The boarding school model, was there an effort to educate people in their communities, or was it all taking them away from their communities?
Many of the children were educated in the communities. At the very beginning, there were two kinds of schools: day schools, which children would go to automatically, which was like the public schools, and they would go from their home to the schools if the school was close enough that they could actually get to in the small reserves where that was possible. And then there was boarding schools, and at the very beginning, children had to apply to go to boarding schools, as they did to private schools in Britain or private schools in Canada, like Upper Canada College.
And was that boarding model effective in your mind, Dr. Clifton? Was that ever documented from a pedagogical perspective?
Obviously, in the French immersion programs, where children are forbidden to speak their native language during the school day, is the way to educate children in another language and to make them proficient in that language. I spent a summer teaching summer school at Bishop's University in south of Montreal, and there were a group of young French children that were in a English immersion program there. And obviously, because we spoke English, they would like to talk to us. And they had 3 levels. If they spoke French, and one of the supervisors or teachers heard them speaking French, they would get reprimanded. The second time, their parents would be told, and the third time they would be sent home if they got caught speaking French. So it was very serious, and that's proven through some very good research of the way of actually getting people to understand and use another language.
All right.
So it was probably an effective way of doing that. Many of the kids in Inuvik, where I worked, would be speaking in Uktutuk, and certainly on the Blackfoot Reserve, when they're in the playroom or they're out on the playground, the kids always spoke Blackfoot. Mark the Wolf reports the same sort of thing at St. Paul's. The kids spoke Blackfoot.
All right.
And his father was an administrator and said, you can, as long as you're not in class, you can speak Blackfoot.
Is there any real hard data on the whole issue of death rates or mortality rates in residential schools? I know this is very tricky because going back over 100 years, we had all kinds of challenges of disease. We think of the Spanish flu or tuberculosis.
Yeah.
Can you speak about the role of disease and what were the mortality rates between, say, on residential schools with children and in the general population in Canada at the time?
The report itself, calculation that we did from the report has 3,201 children identified who died either in school or within a year of leaving school. So there's some ambiguity in terms of whether they should be allocated to being deaths in the schools or not. That almost 50% of the children died of tuberculosis, which was a very serious disease, not only for
almost 50%.
50% died of tuberculosis. And other communicable diseases like whooping cough, diphtheria, influenza, a number of kids died. There's also evidence in the report that when the epidemics hit various residential schools, that sometimes the supervisors who were nursing to the students died as a result of the disease as well. And they were buried in the local cemetery along with the kids.
Okay. Well, look, that's about all the time we have for our discussion. And thank you everyone for the number of questions that you've posed on a very challenging and complex topic. And I want to thank not only our audience, but of course, Dr. Rod Clifton. And frankly, the entire extraordinary team behind the book on this massive project. So thank you so much, Dr. Clifton, for that. And I encourage everyone to read the original TRC report if you can read some 4,000 pages, and to think critically and thoughtfully about what we can do as Canadians to move our nation forward.
Yeah. And we have to thank Frontier Center for sponsoring and supporting this, and being brave enough to actually engage in a debate about something as controversial as Truth and Reconciliation Commission report. So thanks.
Well said. And certainly at the Frontier, we are an independent think tank, and we're not afraid to look at issues as we care about the future of our country and all Canadians. And it is in this spirit that our hope is today has been helpful to you, and certainly food for thought as we seek reconciliation for all Canadians. This book is about an important topic, and it's filled with great emotion and concern. And we certainly wish people all the best as we look to coming together, and as we look to celebrate the upcoming Canada Day.
Canada Day.
We certainly do. And we welcome your comments. And I want to thank the entire team that helped put this on, including Gerard Lasician and Deanna McCurry, and of course, Peter Hawley, and of course, Dr. Rod Clifton. We do welcome your comments and your feedback. And on behalf of all of us at Frontier, I wish to thank all of you for joining us, and be sure to subscribe to our newsletter and stay tuned for the next Thinker's Corner on Frontier. Thank you.